There is a submerged formation off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost inhabited island of Japan, sitting in roughly 25 meters of water in the East China Sea. It was first reported in 1986 by a local diver named Kihachiro Aratek, who was scouting hammerhead shark grounds for a tourism business, and surfaced with a description of what appeared to be a wall. The formation is approximately 50 meters long and 20 meters wide, rises in tiered steps from the seafloor, with right angles, parallel edges, and what look like cut channels running across its upper surface. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus has spent more than 2 decades surveying it. He has mapped platforms, terraces, drainage features, and what he interprets as a carved human face. The last time the seafloor at that depth was above water was at the close of the last ice age, before the rise of the world's first cities. It is called the Yonaguni Monument. And what happened when Kimura decided to take its geometry seriously, not as a coincidence of sandstone fracturing, but as what it appears to be, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed stories in the history of Pacific archaeology. The Yonaguni Monument lies just off Arakawa Bana, the southernmost cape of Yonaguni Island, about 100 kilometers east of the coast of Taiwan and just over 2,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. Its uppermost surface is roughly 5 meters below sea level. Base sits at approximately 27 meters of depth. Rock itself is sandstone and mudstone of the lower Miocene, laid down on the order of 20 million years ago. That part is not in dispute. The dispute concerns what happened to the rock after it was laid down. As a geological object, the stone is old. As an archaeological object, if it is one, it is much younger. Sea level, during the last glacial maximum, was roughly 120 meters below where it sits today. That is established by marine sediment cores, by ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, and by the dating of coral terraces around the Pacific. Water rose unevenly but persistently from about 20,000 years ago until approximately 6,000 BCE, when it reached something close to its modern level. For the formation off Yonaguni to have been worked by human hands, that work has to have happened before the water reached the top of the formation. Kimura's estimate, based on local sea level reconstructions for the Ryukyu Shelf, places the last full exposure of the upper terrace at approximately 10,000 BCE, give or take 1,000 years on either side, is older than Egypt. It is older than Sumer as a city culture. It is older than the wheel, older than any recognized stone monument anywhere in the world by a margin of several thousand years. The thesis of this video is not that Kimura is certainly correct. Thesis is narrower and more defensible. It is that the geometry of the Yonaguni Monument, the right angles, the parallel terraces, the regularly spaced channels, the discrete feature Kimura has named the carved face, has not been accounted for by any published natural formation model in a way that explains the specific features rather than dismissing them as a category. And it is that an ancient written record, set down in Sumerian and Akkadian on clay tablets now held at the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the deliberate destruction by water of a coastal civilization in terms that are remarkably specific about agency, motive, and timing. The Sumerian record in question is the Atrahasis epic, with closely related material in the Eridu Genesis tablet and in the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. These texts describe a council of beings called the Anunnaki, sometimes translated as those who from heaven to earth came, debating, then ordering, the inundation of a populated coast. The texts give the name of the man warned in advance. They give the duration of the flood, Preet. They give the location where the survivors landed. They give the reason the council made the decision it made. Forensic claim of this video is the following. If the Yonaguni monument is what Chimera and a small number of credentialed geologists believe it is, the conventional timeline of human civilization has our problem, and if the Sumerian texts are read not as theology but as testimony, which is what they explicitly present themselves as, they describe something that, by the timing they themselves give, could be the same event that put the upper terrace of Yonaguni underwater. This reading has been challenged. It has not been refuted in print by anyone who has engaged with both the geological evidence at Yonaguni and the specific markers in the Sumerian texts. If you find that the academic literature on submerged structures has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in museum drawers waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. Mainstream geological reading of the Yonaguni Formation is straightforward and, on its own terms, internally coherent. The sandstones of the Yayama group, of which the Yonaguni monument is part, are well known to fracture along two perpendicular sets of joints. Sandstone of this composition, laid down in alternating layers of harder and softer material, weathers in the marine environment in a way that produces flat tops and step-like profiles. The Ryukyu region is tectonically active. Earthquakes and slow uplift expose new surfaces. Wave action does the rest. Mainstream position, articulated by geologists including Robert Schoch of Boston University, after his own dives at the site, is that the Yonaguni Formation is fundamentally natural, that the rectilinear features are the predictable product of well-understood geological processes, and that no human modification is required to explain what is seen. This is not the position of someone hostile to alternative readings. Schoch is the same researcher who argued, beginning in the early 1990s, that the Great Sphinx of Giza is older than the conventional Egyptological dating allows, based on weathering patterns on the enclosure walls. He has been characterized as fringe by mainstream Egyptologists for that work. When he examined Yonaguni, he was a researcher already inclined to see possibility where others see only nature. He dove the site. He looked at the joints. He looked at the parallel terraces and the so-called face. His conclusion, published in his book Voices of the Rocks, and in subsequent technical commentary, was that the formation is primarily natural, with the possibility, not the certainty, that human beings, at some point in deep antiquity, may have lightly modified portions of an already striking natural feature, perhaps quarrying it for stone, perhaps cutting into it for ritual purposes. He stopped well short of calling it a city. The standard Japanese academic position is more dismissive than Schoch's. The geological surveys conducted by mainland Japanese institutions in the 1990s concluded that the formation isn't entirely natural, that the right angles are the consequence of orthogonal jointing in the local sandstone, and that the perceived steps are the differential erosion of bedded layers. Carved face in this reading is pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. Drainage channels are natural runoff features. Platforms are bedding planes exposed by faulting. But there is a further line of mainstream caution worth stating fairly. Ryukyu Archipelago is not known to have hosted a high-population sedentary civilization in the relevant time window. Pre-Jomon and early Jomon archaeological record of the broader Japanese archipelago, while older than was once believed and richer than the standard textbooks of the 20th century allowed, does not show monumental stone architecture from before approximately 3000 BCE. The Jomon people built remarkable wooden structures, complex pottery, and ritual stone circles in northern Honshu and Hokkaido. They did not, in any well-attested case, cut and shape stone on the scale Kimura proposes for Yonaguni. Conventional reading, therefore, does three things simultaneously. Post. It identifies a geologically plausible mechanism for the observed features. It cites the absence of other monumental stonework from the broader region in the relevant period, and it places the burden of proof on those who would argue otherwise. That is the Steelman version of the mainstream position. Stated fairly, it is not unreasonable. The sandstones do fracture orthogonally. Pareidolia is real. Ryukyu archaeological record does not, on its face, supply the cultural context one would expect for a city of this scale at this date. Anyone arguing that the Yonaguni monument is wholly artificial has to account for these objections, not dismiss them. Forensic question that follows is whether the specific features Kimura has documented are consistent with the natural mechanism the mainstream invokes, or whether they require something more. Masaki Kimura earned his doctorate in marine geology from a major Japanese university in the late 1960s. He spent his academic career at the University of the Ryukyus in Okinawa, where he became Professor Emeritus. His specialization is the geology of the Ryukyu Arc and the East China Sea. He is not an outsider to the local geology. He is, by training and by location, the senior expert on the rocks of the seafloor where the Yonaguni monument sits. Kimura first dove the site in the early 1990s, several years after Aratake's discovery, after press reports drew the attention of researchers across Japan. His initial position, as he has stated repeatedly in print, was sceptical. He expected to find a striking natural formation and to confirm the geological survey's conclusion. He did not. What changed his position was not a single feature. It was the accumulation, dive after dive, of specific elements that did not fit the natural fracturing model. He has catalogued them in technical papers and in books written for general audiences over the past 2 decades. First, the orientation. Sandstone joints in the local rock follow predictable strikes, determined by the regional stress field. Kimura measured the strikes of the major linear features on the Yonaguni monument, and found that, while some align with the regional joint pattern, others do not. Terrace edges in particular do not follow the dominant joint direction, follow a different line. One that, if the formation is natural, would require a mechanism not present in the surrounding bedrock. Second, the right angles in 3 dimensions. A joint produces a planar fracture. 2 intersecting joint sets produce intersecting planes, which on a horizontal surface look like right angles. But the Yonaguni monument has features that are not just right-angled in plan view, they are right-angled in elevation as well. The vertical walls meet the horizontal terraces at near-perfect right angles, repeated across multiple terraces at multiple levels. Kimura's measurements show consistency that joint fracturing alone does not produce. Natural step-like profiles in sandstone tend to have rounded interior corners as softer beds erode out from beneath harder caps. The interior corners at Yonaguni are sharp. Third, the channels, cut into the upper surface of the monument, are linear depressions of consistent width. Kimura has measured them. He has photographed the tool mark-like striations on their walls. He has argued that they are consistent with deliberate cutting for water control or for ceremonial drainage. Natural formation reading attributes them to differential erosion along joints. But the channels in question cut across the joint pattern at angles that joint-controlled erosion does not produce. Fourth, the so-called face. On the southwest portion of the monument, partially encrusted with coral, is a roughly 2.5 metre wide feature that, viewed from the correct angle, resembles a human face. Eyes, nose, mouth, brow ridge. Kimura is cautious about this. He has noted that pareidolia is a serious possibility, but he has also documented that the features of the supposed face do not align with the local joint pattern and appear to be carved into a single block of stone that has been deliberately oriented. Fifth, and most consequential, the loose stones, scattered around the base of the monument, are blocks that do not match the bedrock in either composition or provenance. Some appear to be tools. Kimura has recovered objects he interprets as a stone hammerhead, fragments of what may be sculpture, and pieces of what he believes are inscribed stone. Though the inscriptions, weathered by millennia of seawater, are too eroded to read with confidence, the methodology, taken as a whole, is the methodology of a working marine geologist. Kimura did not arrive at the site with a thesis to defend. He measured, mapped, photographed, recovered, and compared. His conclusion, stated cautiously in his peer-reviewed publications and more boldly in his popular books, is that the Yonaguni monument is a partially modified natural formation, a natural sandstone outcrop that human beings, at some point in deep antiquity, shaped into something more. Kimura is not a fringe figure. He is a credentialed marine geologist with decades of fieldwork in the Ryukyu region. He has published in Japanese geological journals. He has presented at international conferences. He has been the subject of features on Japanese state broadcasting, and his finding that the Yonaguni monument is partially worked by human hands at a time when conventional history says no one in the region was capable of such work has been challenged, but has not, to date, been refuted in a peer-reviewed publication that engages with the specific measurements he has made. That is the geological half of the break. The other half is textual. In the early 1970s, a researcher named Zecharia Sitchin published a series of books, beginning with The 12th Planet in 1976, proposing that the Sumerian texts describing the Anunnaki were not mythology in the modern sense, but were intended by their authors as historical testimony. Sitchin was not a credentialed Assyriologist. He was a journalist and amateur translator who had taught himself Sumerian and Akkadian. Mainstream Assyriology has rejected most of his specific readings, but his books drew renewed attention to texts that mainstream Assyriologists had translated decades earlier and largely set aside as religious literature. One of those texts is the Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian, with Sumerian antecedents. The Atrahasis describes a council of the Anunnaki gods deliberating over what to do about the human population that has multiplied along the alluvial coast. The text gives a specific reason for the deliberation. The noise of the cities has disturbed the rest of the chief god. It gives the name of the god who orders the flood, Enlil. It gives the name of the god who warns one man, Enki, the god associated with the waters of the abyss, the god whose city is Eridu, gives the name of the man warned, Atrahasis, meaning approximately exceedingly wise. It gives the duration of the flood, 7 days and 7 nights, and in the parallel account in the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, the flood hero is named Utnapishtim, and the location where his vessel comes to rest is given as a mountain in the north. Break. The moment that connects the two halves of this investigation is the following observation. If the Atrahasis flood is read as the memory of a real event, the most plausible date for that event, given the rating of post-glacial sea levels in the broader region around Sumer and the broader Pacific, falls within a window that overlaps with the last full exposure of the Yonaguni terrace. The window is wide. It is approximately the period between 12,000 BCE and 6,000 BCE. Different scholars place the textual flood at different points within that window. Kimura's geological window for Yonaguni's last full exposure falls inside it. The implication, if both readings are substantially correct, is the following. There existed at some point before the end of the last ice age a coastal civilization sufficiently organized to cut and shape stone on the scale of the Yonaguni monument. That civilization existed in the East China Sea basin, an area that, at the relevant date, was not the network of islands it is today, but a continuous coastal plain, extending from what is now the southern Japanese archipelago through Taiwan and down to the Philippines. Sea level reconstructions for the region show that the area now under the East China Sea was, at the glacial maximum, an exposed coastal shelf of approximately 1 million square kilometres. That is roughly the surface area of Egypt. What is now Yonaguni Island was at that time a hill on a coastal plain. The Yonaguni monument was, at that time, a sandstone outcrop accessible from above, quarryable, shapeable, accessible to whoever was living on the surrounding plain. Plain itself drowned slowly as the ice melted. For the course of approximately 6,000 years, the sea rose at an average of perhaps 1.5 meters per century. The coastline retreated. The cities, if there were cities, went under. The hill on which the monument sits was one of the last surfaces to drown. This reading is correct. The conventional history of East Asian civilization needs to be revised. The conventional history places the earliest sedentary cultures of the Japanese archipelago in the Jomon period, beginning around 14,000 BCE in its earliest pottery-producing phase, and not reaching anything resembling monumental construction until thousands of years later. A worked stone formation off Yonaguni, dated to 10,000 BCE, would not fit into that timeline. It would require a separate cultural tradition, distinct from the Jomon, occupying the now drowned coastal plain to the south, and lost beneath the sea before the Jomon culture in the surviving northern islands reached its mature phase. This is not a small revision. It is the kind of revision that the field has historically been reluctant to make. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, beginning in the mid-1990s under the direction of the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, forced a comparable revision of the timeline for the rise of Near Eastern civilization. For Göbekli Tepe, the conventional view was that monumental architecture required agriculture, and that agriculture began about 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. Göbekli Tepe dates to before agriculture in the region. Its earliest layers are now dated to approximately 9,500 BCE. Pillars are carved with low-relief animals. They weigh up to 10 tons each. Kos. They were erected by people whom the textbooks had said were incapable of erecting them. Revision was forced because the artifact was unambiguous. The Yonaguni monument is less unambiguous. It is also, crucially, underwater, which means it cannot be excavated using standard techniques and cannot be radiocarbon dated directly, because the stone itself contains no datable carbon. What it can be dated against is the sea level. If the upper terrace was worked while above water, the work must predate the date at which the water reached that terrace. For the Ryukyu shelf, that date is approximately 6,000 BCE for the lowest worked surface, and approximately 8 to 10,000 BCE for the upper surfaces, depending on which sea level curve one uses. These are not Kimura's invented numbers. They are the standard numbers used by Japanese marine geologists working on Holocene coastal change. There is a second implication that is more difficult to evaluate but worth stating clearly. For coastal civilization existed in the East China Sea basin in the relevant window, and if its surviving fragments included worked stone of the Yonaguni type, the question becomes whether this civilization left any other trace. Did it leave any record of itself elsewhere, in cultures that survived the inundation? This is the question that brings the Sumerian flood material into focus. Cross-cultural parallel of relevance here is not the Sumerian Atrahasis alone. Host. It is the broader pattern of flood narratives, describing the deliberate destruction of a coastal civilization, found in the recorded traditions of cultures distributed around the Pacific Rim and beyond. Pattern is too widespread to be the diffusion of a single Mesopotamian story. The Sumerian Atrahasis and the Akkadian flood in Gilgamesh are the oldest written examples, but the Mayon Popol Vuh, set down by Kichi scribes in the 16th century from oral tradition, describes a sequence of pre-human destructions, one of which is by flood. The Hopi creation narrative, recorded ethnographically in the early 20th century, describes the destruction by water of a previous world. Chinese tradition of Yu the Great, the legendary engineer emperor who organized the response to a catastrophic flood, places that flood approximately 2000 BCE in conventional Chinese chronology. Late for our purposes, but possibly displaced and condensed in transmission. The Vedic tradition of Manu, preserved in the Shatapatha Brahmana and other late Vedic texts, describes a flood survivor warned in advance by a fish form of the god Vishnu, told to build a vessel, and saved when the vessel comes to rest on a mountain in the north. Structural parallels between the Vedic Manu and the Sumerian Atrahasis are precise enough that mainstream Indology has long acknowledged a probable diffusion or shared source. Structural parallels between the Sumerian Atrahasis and the Hebrew flood narrative in Genesis are sufficiently strong that no serious scholar of either tradition disputes a common source. Structural parallels with the Popol Vuh and the Hopi are looser but persistent. The structural parallel that matters most for our purposes is the one with the East China Sea. The Japanese flood traditions preserved in the 8th century Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, Kojiki, compiled by the scribe Ono no Yasumaro in 712 CE and dedicated to the Empress Genmai, contains creation material that places the formation of the Japanese islands as a deliberate act by the gods Izanagi and Izanami. The material is overtly mythological in its register, but embedded within it, and within the parallel material in the Nihon Shoki of 720 CE, are references to lost lands beneath the sea, to gods who came from across the water, and to a flood event that separated an earlier world from the present one. These references are not as systematic as the Sumerian material. They are fragmentary, post. They were already, by the 8th century, distant memories filtered through generations of priestly transmission. If you want to check this, the relevant translations of the Kojiki are available in the Penguin Classics edition, translated by Donald Philippi, and the Aston translation of the Nihon Shoki has been available since the late 19th century. The relevant translation of Atrahasis is in the Stephanie Daly volume Myths from Mesopotamia, published by Oxford University Press, which can be found in any major university library. The Yonaguni monument can be visited. Diving permits are issued through licensed operators on Yonaguni Island. The records are open. The implication that follows from the implication is the following. Coastal civilization in the East China Sea basin was destroyed by inundation between approximately 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, and if the survivors carried the memory of that destruction with them to the higher ground that became Japan and the lower latitudes that became Southeast Asia, the memory should appear in the oldest surviving textual traditions of those regions, possibly in mythologized form. It does. The Japanese material is consistent with that scenario. It is not proof of that scenario, but it is consistent with it, and no other scenario explains it as economically. The Sumerian material, geographically remote from the East China Sea, presents a different problem. If the Sumerian flood is the same event as the East China Sea inundation, the cultural memory must have crossed continents. That is not impossible, Post-glacial migration patterns are documented archaeologically across thousands of kilometres. But it is not the simplest reading either. The simpler reading is that there were multiple coastal civilizations inundated during the post-glacial sea level rise. That Sumerian memory preserves one such event closer to home, that the Pacific traditions preserve another, and that the pattern of flood narratives reflects a global phenomenon rather than a single shared event. Either way, the conventional history of civilization needs revision. If the flood narratives are the memory of a single global event, that event happened. If they are the memory of multiple regional events, then multiple coastal civilizations existed in the relevant window. Civilizations that the textbook chronology does not include. Both readings require the addition of cultural complexity to the late Pleistocene and early Holocene that mainstream archaeology has, until very recently, refused to accept. Recently, that refusal has begun to soften. Göbekli Tepe is one data point. The submerged structures of Cambay in the Gulf of Khambat, off the coast of western India, are another. Surveyed by Indian government oceanographers in the early 2000s, with finds that include worked wood dated by radiocarbon to approximately 7,500 BCE, structures at Atlat Yam off the coast of Israel, submerged but accessible in approximately 8 to 12 meters of water, are dated to approximately 7,000 BCE and include a stone circle of 7.5-ton stones arranged around a freshwater spring, with human burials of the same period. None of these submerged sites is universally accepted as a worked human settlement, at the level the alternative tradition argues. But the accumulation of cases is changing the burden of proof. The Yonaguni monument adds to that accumulation. If Kimura is right, is a Pacific data point. It would mean that the coastal civilization destroyed by rising seas pattern is not confined to the Mediterranean, the Near East, and the Indian Ocean. It would mean that the pattern extends across the Pacific Basin, and that the Sumerian flood narratives, whatever their direct relationship to East Asian memory, describe an event of the type that the Yonaguni terraces are evidence of. That is the consequence. The conventional dating of when human beings began to organize themselves into city-shaping cultures moves backward by several thousand years. The conventional reading of flood narratives as theological invention or as memory of mere river flooding becomes harder to sustain. The map of the late Pleistocene world changes. The drowned coastal plains of the East China Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf, the Black Sea before its Holocene fill. These become candidates for the lost cultures that the world's oldest written records describe. The academic response to Kimura's work has been, by the standards of geological and archaeological scholarship, unusually thin. Host. There is a difference between a finding that has been refuted and a finding that has been ignored. Form of the response matters. When a mainstream finding is challenged, the conventional process is the publication of a counter paper that engages with the original measurements, proposes an alternative explanation that accounts for the same data, and submits that explanation to peer review. That has not happened with the Yonaguni monument. What has happened instead is characterization. Formation has been characterized in mainstream geological commentary as a natural sandstone feature. The right angles have been characterized as joint-controlled fracturing. The terraces have been characterized as bedded erosion. Face has been characterized as pareidolia. The recovered loose stones have been characterized as scattered debris from natural processes. None of these characterizations is, by itself, unreasonable. What is missing is the published engagement with Kimura's specific measurements showing that the joint orientations do not match, that the interior corners are sharp where natural erosion would produce rounded corners, that the channels cross the joint pattern at angles joint-controlled erosion does not produce. Robert Schoch's published comment is, again, the most careful and the most often cited. Schoch dove the site, examined the formation in person, and concluded that the bulk of the geometry is consistent with natural processes acting on the local sandstone. He left open the possibility of light human modification. He did not engage point by point with Kimura's specific measurements. The two researchers reached different conclusions from the same site, and the difference has not been adjudicated in print. The Japanese mainland geological community has, for the most part, declined to engage at length. The University of the Ryukyus, where Kimura held his post, is a regional institution. Japanese mainland geology is centered in Tokyo and Kyoto. Geological surveys conducted in the mid-1990s by mainland researchers concluded the formation was natural, and the matter, from the mainland perspective, was settled. Subsequent publications referencing the Yonaguni monument from the mainland have largely treated the question as closed. The archaeological community has been more silent still. The Japan Archaeological Association has not, to public knowledge, conducted a major submerged archaeology survey of the monument. The site lies underwater, which removes it from the standard archaeological methodology. Submerged archaeology in Japan is a young discipline. The institutional incentives to investigate a site that, if proven artificial, would force a major revision of the East Asian timeline are not strong. The incentives to leave it alone, to wait for someone else to take the professional risk, are. The Western academic community has responded with even less engagement. The Society for American Archaeology has not published on Yonaguni. The major Western journals of Asian archaeology have not run technical papers on it. The mainstream English language treatment of Yonaguni is in popular books and in television documentaries. Graham Hancock devoted a chapter to it in Underworld, published in 2002, drawing on Kimura's published work and on his own dives at the site with Kimura's guidance. Hancock is a journalist, not a credentialed archaeologist. He has been characterized as fringe by the archaeological establishment. The academic response to his work has consisted largely of dismissal of his framing rather than engagement with the specific evidence he reports. This is the pattern that the forensic skeptic in the audience knows well. It is the pattern that drives the channel's central beat. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. The academic response to Kimura, to Hancock, to Schoch's more cautious version of the same suggestion, has been characterization rather than refutation. There has been no published paper showing, using Kimura's own measurements, that the orientations he measured can be explained by natural processes. There has been no published paper showing that the interior corner geometry he documented is consistent with marine erosion of the relevant sandstone. There has been no published paper engaging with the specific channel cuts that cross the local joint pattern. The asymmetry of the response is the point. A site that, if artificial, requires the rewriting of major textbooks has been treated with less analytical attention than minor finds that confirm the standard chronology. Pattern is not unique to Yonaguni. The Indian government survey of the Cambay structures was met with similar institutional silence in Western archaeology. The work of Mark Hempsell, spacecraft systems engineer formerly of Bristol University, and Alan Bond, aerospace engineer and architect of advanced propulsion concepts in British engineering, on the astronomical interpretation of the planisphere of Nineveh, has been similarly received. Their analysis has not been refuted in print. It has been characterized as outside the mainstream and largely left alone. The structure of the dismissal has a name in the philosophy of science. It is the dismissal by jurisdiction. The geologists do not engage with Yonaguni because, if it is artificial, it is an archaeological question. The archaeologists do not engage with it because, if the joint orientations are the issue, it is a geological question. The Assyriologists do not engage with the alternative readings of the flood texts because, they say, those require a familiarity with comparative mythology that lies outside their training. The comparative mythologists do not engage with the geological correlations because, they say, those require a familiarity with marine geology that lies outside their training. Each discipline points to the next. None of them publishes the refutation. Kimura's papers are available. They are in Japanese and in English. They are catalogued in the standard geological databases. Measurements are reproducible. Divers can go to the site, can take their own readings, can compare. The University of the Ryukyus has not retracted his work. He has not been censured for it. He has simply, as a professional matter, been allowed to retire into the position of the man who said the thing the mainstream prefers not to deal with. Forensic skeptic in this audience knows what to do with that. The question is not whether the mainstream view is true. The question is whether the mainstream view has been published with the analytical engagement that the alternative view has received. The answer, in the case of the Yonaguni monument, is that it has not. The work that has been published in detail is Kimura's work. The work that has not been published in detail is the refutation. That is the dismissal. It is not loud. It is not conspiratorial. It is the quiet absence of the paper that should have been written and was not. To understand what the Yonaguni monument might be a fragment of, it helps to walk the geography of the East China Sea basin as it stood at the end of the last ice age. Basin then was not water. It was land. A broad coastal plain extending from the southernmost tip of what is now the Korean peninsula, sweeping south past what is now Kyushu, across what is now the open sea, and merging seamlessly with the coast of what is now Taiwan, the Yangtze River, which today empties into the East China Sea near Shanghai, then crossed the plain and entered the sea hundreds of kilometers further east. The Yellow River, which today empties near the Shandong Peninsula, then continued across the plain that is now the Yellow Sea. Two great rivers of East Asia delivered their sediment not into the sea, but into a delta complex on a plain now drowned. Plain was inhabited. Pollen cores taken from the East China seafloor and from the surviving land surfaces nearby record the vegetation. Temperate forests of oak and pine in the north, subtropical broadleaf forests in the south, with intermittent grassland and wetland mosaics across the river valleys. Climate at the glacial maximum was several degrees colder than today. By approximately 14,000 BCE, it was warming. By 12,000 BCE, it was warming faster. By 10,000 BCE, the ice sheets of the high northern latitudes were collapsing in earnest, and the world's oceans were rising at rates that, in human historical terms, were rapid. Possibly several meters per century, at intervals corresponding to the major meltwater pulse events. First such pulse, known in the literature as meltwater pulse 1A, occurred between approximately 14,500 and 12,500 BCE. The sea rose by roughly 15 to 20 meters during that interval. The second, meltwater pulse 1B, occurred around 11,500 BCE, with a comparable rise. The coastal plains of the East China Sea basin, which had been habitable for tens of thousands of years, began to drown in pulses separated by decades or by generations. The shoreline did not retreat smoothly. It retreated in jumps. Village situated on a low rise on the plain could find itself, within the lifetime of a single elder, suddenly within sight of the sea, then in salt marsh, then under brackish water. What was on the plain has been almost entirely lost. the sediment cover laid down by the rising sea, by the redeposition of river loads, by the slow rain of marine debris over 10,000 years, has buried whatever surface culture existed there. The shore edge erosion, at the most rapid phases of the sea level rise, would have stripped exposed surfaces. The cultural record is, by the nature of the inundation, largely destroyed. What survives are the high points, the surfaces that were the last to drown, that stayed above water longest, that might have been the locations of the final retreat. The hill on which the Yonaguni monument sits is one such surface. It is on the seaward edge of the now island, on the southern face, oriented toward what at the time was the open coastal plain. If it was a worked surface, it was a worked surface at the edge of a settled landscape. Perhaps a quarry, perhaps a ceremonial site, perhaps a defensive position. The interpretation is open. The geometry is what we have. People who would have lived on that plain are also largely unknown to us. The genetic evidence from the surviving populations of the region, the Jomon descendants in modern Japanese populations, the indigenous Taiwanese populations, the Austronesian-speaking peoples, whose languages spread out from Taiwan in the mid-Holocene, suggests a complex pattern of migration and admixture from the late Pleistocene onward. The coastal plain population, if it existed, would have left genetic traces in the descendants who fled to higher ground as the water rose. The Jomon people of the surviving Japanese islands are the most likely candidates for those descendants. Their material culture, beginning around 14,000 BCE in the pottery record, is older than agricultural civilization anywhere else in the world. That is an extraordinary fact and worth pausing on. The Jomon were making pottery, a sophisticated technology requiring the controlled use of fire, the preparation of clay, and the management of firing temperatures. By approximately 14,000 BCE, the conventional account of human technological development places agriculture as a precondition for sedentism, sedentism as a precondition for storage, storage as a precondition for pottery. Jomon were sedentary, were storing food, and were making pottery before agriculture had developed anywhere in the world. They did this in the surviving high ground of an archipelago whose southern, low-lying portions were drowning. If the surviving Jomon were the survivors of an inundated coastal civilization, the high level of technological complexity they brought to the surviving islands makes sense. But it is harder to explain on the conventional model, cosmology of the Jomon. To the extent it can be reconstructed from their material culture, is fragmentary. They built stone circles in the late Jomon period, beginning around 2000 BCE, the most famous at Oyu in Akita Prefecture and at Komakino in Aomori. The circles are aligned to solstices and equinoxes. They were, on the available evidence, places of ritual gathering rather than habitation. The Jomon made figurines. The Dogu, with stylized features that have invited comparison with figurines from cultures around the world, including Mesopotamian figurines of the Ubaid period, though the comparison is contested and the diffusion route, if any, has not been demonstrated. What the Jomon believed about their own origins is largely unrecorded in writing. Because writing came to Japan with the Chinese script in the early centuries of the Common Era, 2,000 years after the late Jomon, pre-literate record is preserved only in those traditions that survived into the literate period, and were captured by the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki compilers. The Kojiki, again, was completed in 712 CE by the scribe Ono no Yasumaro. Its opening passages describe a primordial period of separation, the heavens and the earth pulling apart, the islands of Japan being formed by deliberate action, the sea being filled or emptied by the will of gods. Mythologized framing has obscured, but has not necessarily destroyed, the underlying memory of geographic transformation. The Sumerian cosmological context is much better preserved because the Sumerians wrote their writing system, the cuneiform script developed at Uruk in the late 4th millennium BCE, was the world's first. The earliest tablets, dated to approximately 3300 BCE, are administrative, records of grain, of livestock, of labourers, of beer rations. The mythological and historical texts come later, copied and recopied through the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. The flood narrative in Atrahasis, in the form we have it, dates as a physical tablet to approximately 1700 BCE. The narrative it records is older. How much older is debated. The internal references to events and to chronology suggest that the underlying memory is from a much earlier period, possibly from the formative centuries of Sumerian civilization itself, in the 5th and 6th millennia BCE, possibly from before that. The Sumerians located their own origins in the marshes at the head of the Persian Gulf, in the city of Eridu, which their own tradition called the First City. Eridu was excavated by the Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and by the British archaeologist Seton Lloyd in campaigns running from 1946 through 1949. As occupation levels date to approximately 5400 BCE. The site sits on what is now the Iraqi desert, several hundred kilometers from the modern coast of the Persian Gulf. At the time of its earliest occupation, the coast of the Persian Gulf was much further north. The Gulf itself was a recent intrusion of marine water into what had been, during the glacial period, a deep river valley. Drowning of the Persian Gulf, like the drowning of the East China Sea basin, was a slow event of the post-glacial period, complete, more or less, by about 4000 BCE, if the Sumerians remembered the drowning of the Gulf Valley. If Eridu's tradition of being the first city included the memory of a still earlier civilization in the valley below, then their flood narratives might preserve a regional Mesopotamian memory rather than a global one. This is the conservative reading. The more expansive reading is that the flood narratives are descriptions of an event widely experienced. Both readings, on the geological evidence, are consistent with what happened. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as the gods who came down from the sky. The literal translation of the term is approximately those of princely seed, or, in some readings, those who from heaven to earth came. They were, in the Sumerian texts, a council of beings who organized the world, who built cities, who taught humans the arts of civilization, who set the foundations of agriculture and law and writing. They were not, in the Sumerian framing, abstract divinities. They were specific beings with names, biographies, rivalries, and physical locations. Anu was the chief. He resided in An, the sky place. Enlil was the air lord. His city was Nippur. Enki, also called Ea, was the lord of the abyss. His city was Eridu. Inanna, the queen of heaven, descended to the underworld and returned. These were not allegorical beings in the Sumerian register. They were treated as historically present. The argument made by Zechariah Sitchin, by Mauro Biglino, and by other researchers in the alternative tradition is that the Sumerian framing should be taken on its own terms, not as theology imposed retrospectively on a literal claim, but as a literal claim that later traditions theologized. Whether one accepts that argument or not, the Sumerian texts themselves are clear about what they intend to report. Report councils, they report deliberations, they report deliberate floods, they give names, durations, and outcomes. The Sumerian king list, preserved most completely on the Weld-Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, makes the structure of the Sumerian historical claim unusually explicit. Prism is a small four-sided clay object inscribed on all sides in tightly packed cuneiform. dating physically to the early 2nd millennium BCE. It was translated initially by Stephen Langdon in the 1920s. The list gives the kings of the Sumerian cities in order, from the first kingship after the world was made, down through the historical period, and into the early reigns of the 2nd millennium BCE. The earliest kings, the antediluvian kings, reigned for impossible lengths. Alulim, the first king at Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor reigned for 36,000 years. Total reign of the 8 antediluvian kings is 241,200 years. The numbers are obviously not literal in the modern sense. They signify an antediluvian world of different rules, different lengths, different conditions. After the 8 kings, the prism records simply that the flood swept over. After the flood, the kingships continue, but the reigns are of plausible length. Hundreds of years for the immediately post-Diluvian kings, then 10 or 20 or 50 for the later historical kings. The transition is sharp. The antediluvian period is presented as different in kind from the post-Diluvian. The Hebrew narrative in Genesis, dependent on the Sumerian, transforms the rationale. In Genesis, the flood is sent because of human wickedness, not because of population pressure. The duration is given as 40 days and 40 nights, with the floodwaters remaining for 150 days. Vessel comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The covenant that follows places limits on bloodshed. Genealogies that precede the flood narrative give specific lifespans for the antediluvian patriarchs. Methuselah at 969 years, Noah at 950 years at his death, that parallel, in their extraordinary length, the lifespans of the antediluvian kings on the Sumerian king list. The Hebrew numbers are smaller. The structural pattern is the same. Flood, in the Atrahasis account, is sent because the gods are disturbed by the proliferation of humans on the coastal plains. The reasoning given in the text is specific. Humans have multiplied beyond the gods' tolerance. Their noise, the noise of large concentrated populations, has reached the chief god's residence and disturbed his rest. He orders the flood. Enki, who values his work in shaping humanity, secretly warns Atrahasis. Atrahasis builds a vessel. The flood comes. It lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When it recedes, Atrahasis emerges, and the gods, having reconsidered, allow the survivors to repopulate the world. But, with limits placed on human fertility, on lifespan, and on the relationship between humanity and the gods, that boundary corresponds, even approximately, to a real geological event, to the rapid sea level rise that drowned the coastal civilizations of the late Pleistocene. The textual, memory and the geological record line up. The Yonaguni monument, if it is what Kimura believes it is, would be a fragment of that antediluvian world, not the only fragment, not the most spectacular, just one piece of stone, off the southern coast of a small Ryukyu island, with right angles that should not exist. The drowned coastal cultures that the texts may describe are not lost in the sense that nothing of them survives. They are lost in the sense that almost nothing of them survives. Fragments that do survive are scattered. The Cambay structures in the Gulf of Kambat, the Atlat Yam, circles off Israel, discovered in 1984 by the marine archaeologist Ehud Galili, and dated to approximately 7000 BCE. Universally accepted as an inundated Neolithic settlement, the submerged structures investigated by Indian government oceanographers off the coast of Mahabalipuram, the submerged structures off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, contested in interpretation, the drowned plain of Doggerland between Britain and Denmark, surveyed by teams from the University of Birmingham and other British institutions from the early 2000s onward, where Mesolithic tools and bone artifacts have been dredged from the floor by commercial fishing operations for over a century. Doggerland was inundated, in major phases, by approximately 6000 BCE, with a final catastrophic event possibly associated with the Storegga submarine landslide off the coast of Norway around 6200 BCE, producing a tsunami that may have completed the drowning. The Yonaguni terraces, the Sunderland Shelf, between the Indonesian islands, which holds an exposed land area larger than Egypt, and which has not, at the time of recording, been systematically surveyed for archaeological remains. These are the candidates. They are the places one would look if one believed the texts. The most fully preserved cross-cultural parallel to the Yonaguni question is the Sumerian flood narrative itself, in its three main textual forms. First is the Sumerian language Eridu Genesis tablet, held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. The second is the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, preserved on multiple tablet sets at the British Museum and elsewhere, with the most complete version dating physically to approximately 1700 BCE. Third is the flood account on the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, held at the British Museum, recovered by the team of Hormuzd Rassam from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 1850s. Each text gives a slightly different account, but the structural elements are the same across all three. Council of the gods, called the Anunnaki in the broader corpus, and named individually in the specific texts, deliberates over what to do about human overpopulation along the river plains. A decision is made to send a flood. One god, identified as Enki in the Sumerian and as Ea in the Akkadian, opposes the decision but cannot openly defy it. He warns one chosen man through a dream or through indirect speech, instructing him to build a vessel of specified dimensions and to load it with the seed of all living things. Flood arrives. It lasts a specified period. The vessel comes to rest on a mountain. The survivor offers sacrifice. The gods, having reconsidered, regret the destruction and establish a new arrangement with humanity. The new arrangement includes constraints on human fertility, on lifespan, and on the gods' future tolerance for the noise of cities. The Gilgamesh 11th tablet account is the most detailed and the most studied. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, seeking the secret of immortality, finds his way to Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood. Utnapishtim tells him the story. The chief god, here called Enlil, was disturbed by the noise of humans. Ea, sworn not to warn humanity, whispered the warning to Utnapishtim through the wall of a reed hut, technically violating no oath. Utnapishtim built a vessel of specified dimensions, 120 cubits on each side, with 7 decks. He loaded silver and gold and cattle and the seed of all living things. The storm came for 6 days and 7 nights. The wind and the flood swept the land. On the 7th day the storm broke. The vessel came to rest on a mountain Utnapishtim names, the mountain of Nimush in some translations, or Nisir in others. Dove and the swallow and the raven were sent out. The raven did not return. The Hebrew parallel is so close in structure that no serious scholar of either tradition doubts the dependence. The Genesis flood narrative was composed in the second half of the first millennium BCE, drawing on Mesopotamian sources transmitted through centuries of contact between Hebrew scribal culture and the Babylonian world. Contact intensified during the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE. The Hebrew account changed the names, changed the theology, extended the duration, and removed the polytheistic council. The structure remained. The Vedic parallel in the story of Manu is more distant in form but recognizable in outline. Manu, the first man and the lawgiver, is warned by a fish, later identified as an avatar of Vishnu, that a flood is coming. He builds a vessel. He saves the seed of life. The flood comes. Vessel comes to rest on the northern mountain. Mount Himavat in the Himalayas. The Vedic account, in the form preserved in the Shatapatha Brahmana, is dated as a text to approximately 700 BCE, with oral antecedents going back much further into the second millennium BCE. The shared source with the Sumerian is debated. Direct diffusion is one option. Common Indo-European inheritance is another. Independent invention from a similar underlying event is a third. Paul View of the Keek Maya, set down in the 16th century from older oral material, describes a sequence of pre-human destructions. First humans, made of mud, dissolve. The second humans, made of wood, are destroyed by flood and by a rebellion of their own household objects. Only the third creation, the humans made of maize, succeeds. Flood in the Popol Vuh is not the inundation of a coastal civilization. It is the destruction of an earlier creation, but the structural element. Destruction by water, as a hinge in the history of humanity, is present. Hopi creation traditions, recorded ethnographically by Frank Waters in his Book of the Hopi published in 1963, describe 4 worlds in succession. Third world, an advanced and technologically capable civilization, was destroyed by a great flood. The few survivors were guided through reeds and across waters to the present fourth world. The Hopi place this transition in deep antiquity. The Waters account is contested. Hopi traditionalists have objected to elements of his framing, arguing that he combined elements of the tradition that should not have been combined. But the broad structure of the flood destruction of the Third World is consistent across multiple Hopi sources. Pattern across these traditions is not, by itself, evidence of a single shared event. Floods happen. Cultures along rivers and along coasts will, over the long span of human history, experience devastating floods and will encode them in narrative. What is striking about the specific pattern in the texts I have just described is the recurring elements that go beyond mere flood. The deliberate agency of a council of beings, the specific naming of a survivor, the building of a vessel of specified dimensions, the duration of the flood given in days, the mountain landing, the constraints on humanity after the event. These are not the generic elements of a flood story. They are the specific elements of a particular narrative. The conventional explanation for the recurrence of these elements is diffusion. The Sumerian story spread westward into the Hebrew tradition and eastward into the Vedic tradition. And the elements that are common across these texts are common because they share a Mesopotamian origin. This explanation accounts for the Sumerian Hebrew Vedic resemblances reasonably well. It does not account, except through highly speculative diffusion chains, for the Pacific traditions, for the Hopi, for the Mayan Popol Vuh, for the fragmentary Japanese material in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. The expansive explanation, the one that the alternative tradition favours, is that the specific elements were preserved across so many traditions because the event they describe was experienced across many cultures simultaneously. Coastal civilizations all around the post-glacial world drowned. The survivors carried the memory inland. The memory was encoded in oral tradition and, much later, in writing. The Sumerian version is the oldest written, but it is not the only memory. The Yonaguni monument, if it is what Kimura believes, is the kind of fragment one would expect to find from such a civilization. Stonework above water. At a time the conventional history says no one was working stone, then submerged, then largely forgotten. Except for the persistent traditions, as among the Pacific cultures, that something like this had once existed and had been destroyed by water. Conventional reading of the Sumerian texts is that they are theology, that the flood narrative encodes ideas about divine justice and human limits, that the Council of the Anunnaki is a literary device, that the names and durations are symbolic. Forensic reading is that the texts say what they say. They report a council, report a deliberate flood. They report a survivor. They give names, locations, durations. They were preserved by a literate culture for 2,000 years, not as theology but as history. Placed in the king lists, used to calibrate chronology, treated as the boundary between two world orders. The Yonaguni monument is not the proof of the Sumerian texts. The Sumerian texts are not the proof of the Yonaguni monument. They are independent lines of evidence that, on a literal reading of each, describe a phenomenon. The drowning of coastal civilization in the post-glacial period, for which the conventional history does not yet have a complete account. The strongest objection to the central thesis of this video is the one offered most cautiously by Robert Schoch and most categorically by mainstream Japanese geology. Deserves to be stated in its strongest form before any response. The Yonaguni monument is, on the natural formation reading, a striking example of a phenomenon that is geologically well documented. Sandstones of the relevant composition, laid down in alternating beds of differing hardness, fracture along orthogonal joint sets when subjected to the appropriate stresses. Ryukyu region is tectonically active. The local rocks have been subjected to repeated stresses over millions of years. When such a formation is exposed to wave action over thousands of years of changing sea level, the differential erosion of bedded layers produces step-like profiles. The intersection of joint sets at high angles produces rectilinear features. The combination of bedded erosion and joint-controlled fracturing can produce, in the appropriate sandstone, formations that look strikingly artificial without being so. There are examples elsewhere in the world. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland produces, through entirely natural processes acting on basalt, columnar structures of such regularity that early modern observers attributed them to deliberate construction. The Devil's Tower in Wyoming is another example of natural columnar structure that has been mythologized as artificial in some traditions. The Mexican Hat Formation, the Hopewell Rocks, the various flatterons of the American West. All are formations that demonstrate, beyond serious dispute, that natural geological processes can produce features of regularity that human observers initially attribute to construction. The Yonaguni monument on this reading is one such formation. Right angles are the product of orthogonal jointing. Terraces are the product of bedded erosion. The channels are the product of joint-controlled drainage. During the period the formation was above water. Posed face is pareidolia. The loose stones are erosional debris. No single feature of the formation on this reading requires human agency to explain. Cumulative impression of artificial work is the product of human pattern recognition. The same pattern recognition that produces faces in clouds and animals in star arrangements. Further line of mainstream objection is the absence of supporting context. Civilization capable of cutting and shaping stone on the scale, Kimura proposes, should have left other traces, tool industries, ceramic remains, occupation sites on the surrounding islands that were also above water at the relevant date. The archaeological record of the Ryukyu Islands and of the surrounding region does not, to date, contain evidence of such a civilization. The Jomon record, rich as it is, does not include monumental stonework from the relevant window. The expected supporting evidence is on the conventional reading absent, and the absence of supporting evidence is itself evidence, not proof, but a strong indicator that the natural formation reading is the more parsimonious. This is the strongest version of the counter case. It is not unreasonable. It rests on well-documented geological processes, on the comparative absence of supporting archaeological evidence, and on the principle of parsimony. The preference for the simpler explanation when multiple explanations are available. The response to the counter case is not to reject it, but to test it against the specific measurements. Kimura's published work documents joint orientations on the formation that do not match the regional joint pattern. The differential erosion model predicts step-like profiles with rounded interior corners as softer beds undercut harder caps. The interior corners at Yonaguni, as Kimura has documented them, are sharp. Pareidolia argument applies to the supposed face, but does not address the right angle geometry, which is a measurable property rather than an interpretive impression. The absence of supporting archaeological evidence is a fair point, but the supporting evidence, if it existed, would have been on the drowned coastal plain, which is now beneath up to 120 metres of postglacial sediment and seawater. Countercase, in its strongest form, identifies a real difficulty with the artificial formation reading. It also leaves specific measurements unaccounted for. Those measurements remain on the table. The state of the debate is genuinely unresolved. Forensic position is not that Kimura is certainly correct. It is that the countercase has not, in published form, addressed the specific elements of the case it would need to address to be considered a refutation. Till it does, the question remains open in a way that the mainstream framing implies it does not. The central claim of this video is substantially correct. If the Yonaguni monument is the worked remains of a late Pleistocene or early Holocene coastal culture, and if the Sumerian flood narratives are read as memory of the inundation that destroyed such cultures, the consequences for the conventional account of human history are specific. The earliest monumental construction by human beings would move backward by approximately 5,000 years. The conventional date of around 5000 BCE for the earliest substantial temple architecture would be displaced by Yonaguni's window of around 10,000 BCE, joining Göbekli Tepe's similar date in southeastern Turkey as evidence for a global pattern of pre-agricultural monumentality. The relationship between sedentism, agriculture, and monumental construction would need to be reformulated. The map of the late Pleistocene world would acquire new candidate locations for inundated cultures. The Sunda Shelf between modern Indonesia and Malaysia, Persian Gulf Valley before its Holocene flooding, Black Sea Basin before its rapid flooding event around 6000 BCE, the North Sea Doggerland, the Yonaguni Shelf. Each becomes a candidate for systematic survey. Reading of the world's earliest written records would shift. Sumerian flood narratives, the Vedic Manu account, the Hebrew Genesis flood, the Pacific traditions of pre-human destructions by water. These texts would be read not as theological inventions but as testimony, however mythologized through millennia of transmission, of events whose physical traces are at last beginning to be surveyed. What this analysis establishes at minimum is that the Yonaguni monument, as Kimura has measured it, contains features that the published mainstream geology has not adequately accounted for. This analysis does not establish is that the formation is certainly artificial, or that the Sumerian flood narratives certainly describe its inundation. The artifact is real. Kimura's measurements are published. The Sumerian tablets exist. The question of what the formation is, and of what the texts describe, remains genuinely open. The Yonaguni monument is in approximately 25 metres of water off Arakawa Bana, the southern cape of Yonaguni Island, Japan. It can be dived. Permits are available through licensed operators on the island. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum. The Sumerian king list on the Weld Blundell Prism is in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. The Eridu Genesis tablet is in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. These artifacts are real. They can be examined. Masaki Kimura, marine geologist and professor emeritus of the University of the Ryukyus, has published his measurements. Papers Ayres catalogued in the standard geological databases. Stephanie Daly's translation of the Mesopotamian flood texts is available in the Myths from Mesopotamia volume from Oxford University Press. What sank under the East China Sea at the close of the last ice age, and whether the people who wrote down the Atrahasis flood remembered something true, is still open. It has been open since Kihachiro Aratake found the wall in 1986. It is still open now,